Over the next hour, we are going to be taking a peek into the future. Our panel will be sharing their expertise and what they believe the next century brings in terms of developments in neuroscience, the environment, technology, learning, and global levels of education. The key question we will all be considering is, what is it that students and teachers really need to learn if they're not just going to thrive but survive the next century? I think Professor Jon Furlong touched on this in the last session where he said the main question had to be, what do the kids need? I'm delighted to be joined by the perfect panel to discuss this, Dr. Paul Howard-Jones, Dr. Jon Turney, Professor Ros Sutherland and Dr. Angeline Barrett. Each will be talking for about 10 minutes, then there'll be an opportunity for discussion and questions. You can also carry on tweeting at #GSOE Centenary. My name, incidentally, is Michael Shaw, and I'm Deputy Editor of the Times Educational Supplement. I'm proud to say the TS is actually slightly older than this department. It was founded in 1910, so a year after the university gained its Royal Charter, but 3 years before the Graduate School of Education. And for our centenary, I spent an unhealthy amount of time in our archives looking back at what we'd written. And the depressing stroke entertaining thing about it was quite how similar the stories were. Earlier on in the session, I think a head teacher mentioned they'd been concerned by the story about sending the military into schools to teach. And this was something the TES obviously covered in 1915 and was quite dismissive about then. Michael Gove's comments last week about English literature, saying that he felt pupils must read a whole book rather than reading extracts. We did that on the front page of the TES in 1923. The only way to stop the debate about what is being taught becoming so retro and circular is to do exactly what we're doing now, and that's to examine some of the developments that are changing the way we consider education. And a prime example of that is neuroscience. So I'm delighted that our first speaker is an internationally recognised authority on neuroscience and education, who's done a fabulous job also of debunking some of the myths that surround it. If you've not seen his lectures on computer games and on how computers rewire our brains, I recommend looking them up on YouTube tonight. It's Dr. Paul Howard-Jones.
Good morning. Do you want me to use this thing? Is this helpful? You do want me to use it? Absolutely. Okay, so, there's a sense in which we're asking today, what do children need to know for the next century? But another question that I'd like to ask alongside that is how they should learn what they need to learn as well. And obviously I'm coming from a psychology, neuroscience background, and an issue which I do get asked sometimes is, well, psychology and neuroscience have been around for quite a long time, and maybe we're at the stage now where we can ask the question, what did psychology and neuroscience ever do for us? And this is particularly in my mind at the moment because I've just completed with Tim J the first draft of a review for the Royal Society dealing with this particular question. And here are some of the things that have actually been found to be effective using laboratory and classroom-based studies. And all of these things should enhance learning, particularly of STEM subjects. So, we know now that computer-based training of quantitative ability for early years can be effective in terms of narrowing the gap between the disadvantaged and the advantaged. We know that the training of executive function and mental rotation can be important for giving children advantage. We know that physical exercise supports executive function. By the way, when I say executive function, I mean our ability to concentrate, to think, and to focus on our learning. Metacognition and emotion. We have now some psychological approaches to dealing with maths anxiety, which we know can improve achievement. Space learning, the idea of spacing learning sessions rather than massing them all together. The interleaving of different types of learning. Especially worked examples. So there's been some fantastic work in the last few years showing that rather than just giving children problems to solve in algebra, those problems should actually be interleaved with special worked examples that show how Billy or whoever got it right or got it wrong and why they got it right or got it wrong. And that seems to be a much more efficient way of developing children's mathematics understanding. The role of testing in promoting learning, not just as an evaluative tool, but as something which, rehearses retrieval. Whole class learning games, and My personal research is in that area of using uncertain reward, which I know many of you are aware of. Combining direct instructions, telling children what they should do, and actually giving them opportunities to find out what the answers are as well. That judicious combination can be very effective. Concreteness fading approaches. Now, if you don't know what those are, the idea is that concrete representations can be immediately very accessible. So actually they can be very effective at introducing a concept in its initial form. However, abstract representations, such as working models or actually diagrams, although they're more difficult to access initially, they can give you better long-term retention, better long-term understanding. So the idea is to move from the concrete to the abstract. And enactment, which to some extent is what I'm doing now because I'm also using gesture, and we have a better understanding now about how that works through our understanding of mirror neurons, for example, and the fact that your neurons, your motor neurons, are activating when I'm moving my hand as if you're moving your hand. So it gives you a little bit of an insight into my mind. So these sorts of things, these are areas that we can apply right now. We have the evidence to say, yes, these can be effective. Now, of course, an issue here is that they are not being applied now. And when you look at something like space learning has been known about for over 100 years. Over 100 years. It was first discovered by Ebbinghaus in the 19th century. So there are huge issues here about how we're going to try to use what we know from science in ways that can improve education. It's certainly not a done deal. But what I wanted to focus on particularly today is we're talking about what children should learn in the future. And I personally believe that in the future, because of the massive amount of information that we have accessible, the way in which we use information and our cognitive functions in particular are going to be a new focus for education. So when you leave education, you leave with your exams results, but perhaps another really important thing that you leave with is your brain and your ability to use basic cognitive functions, strong cognitive functions in all sorts of different areas. And one of the most important type of cognitive function is working memory. That's your ability to hold in your attention bits of information, and it's quite limited in many respects. Now, there have been a lot of commercial attempts to try to improve cognitive function, and this is one of them. And you can see the frustration. So, who's that lady? I've forgotten the name now. Who's that lady? Nicole Kidman, that's right. You can see Nicole Kidman getting very frustrated there because she's got such a low brain age. And these things can be very motivating. In fact, some research, normally I stand up and say, well, these things have never been evaluated. But actually, a study has just come out in PLOS 1, which actually shows that this particular product can be quite effective in some respects in terms of training executive function, which doesn't surprise me for reasons which will become apparent. There's a massive interest in science, in psychology, in neuroscience, and in education, in brain training, and this gives you some idea. I just put in the word brain training into Web of Knowledge, and you can see that there's a massive explosion at the moment of interest. A lot of these papers are saying it works, it works. A lot of papers are saying, no, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And what's happening here is the sort of debate you get before science reaches some sort of consensus and says, well, actually, it works if you do this, and if you don't do that, then it won't work. And just to give you an example of what I mean, this is a sort of algorithm that's used to train your working memory. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you several images, okay, and then I'm going to get to a point and I'm going to say, is this the same as 1 back or 2 back or 3 back? Okay, I'm not going to tell you how many back, so you have to hold them all in your head. This is called the N-back test, okay, the N-back test. Here we go, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Oh, is that the same as 2 back? No. Oh, well done. No, it's not. 2 back was this. Okay, so in an adaptive piece of technology, probably the next one you get would be more difficult because you got it correct. Okay, so the technology adapts to try to keep you at a constant level of challenge when you're using this sort of test. Now, this is actually a laboratory-based task. And it's been shown that if young people, and I'm talking about young adults, do this for 30 minutes a day, over 19 days, it's not just their working memory that gets better, it appears to be their fluid intelligence, their ability to apply their minds to novel situations. And fluid intelligence is one of the best predictors we have of academic and professional success. So this research is very important. I have to say, as I've already mentioned, it's all very controversial. The stuff I mentioned at the beginning, that's all stuff that we know for sure, okay? This stuff is breaking, this stuff is emergent, but I think in the next 10, certainly next 100 years, we are going to crack it. So at the moment, we've got people like Suzanne Yegi, who did this study saying it works. We've got other groups who've tried to do it again and shown that, in fact, that it doesn't work. So, you know, this is not a done deal. I'm not saying that it's actually, that we're there yet, but it's interesting. And it's not least interesting because, in fact, whilst the scientists have been struggling to achieve this with their MBAC tests, we're finding that ordinary action video games are already achieving some of these effects. So action video games can improve visual motor performance, switching visual attention, suppressing visual distraction, even contrast sensitivity, which I find very interesting. In fact, it is being used now as a method to improve eyesight when there are difficulties with eyes, because contrast sensitivity is a primary factor limiting sight, and use of action video games can help train and exploit the neural plasticity of the visual pathways. And of course it also teaches effective response, and I think there's a pretty well conclusive evidence that violent video games increase aggressive tendencies, pro-social video games improve empathetic responses. And this is because, we think this is because the increase in dopamine in the reward system and that uptake of dopamine in the reward system accelerates the rate at which neurons make connections. And it also explains some of the highly addicted behaviours that you can see amongst teenagers with respect to video games. And yeah, we're using this already in the classroom. There's an app that teaches downloading. It's being used about 2,000 or 3,000 times a month in 20 countries across the world. And what teachers are doing are using these effects to actually teach whole topics in the class. And we don't know the extent to which a whole curriculum can be delivered using whole class gaming, but the results at the moment are looking very, very positive. But combining that sort of technology, that gaming technology, with these working memory algorithms could be very important in the future. And in fact, Suzanne Yegi's one of her latest studies has done this with children. And it's shown that these improvements in fluid intelligence can last amongst children over several months. So I suppose, I won't go on to that quite yet, because that's a little bit... I suppose what I'm saying is that, yes, I believe that in the future, what children will need to do is to actually not just come out with exam grades, but actually come out with improved brains and minds, and particularly in terms of those basic cognitive functions, because in a world where all information is available at the fingertips, the ability to focus, to concentrate, the ability to inhibit actions, the ability to switch attention, these are things which are going to be increasingly important. And so this is one area, I think, where neuroscience and psychology is going to make a difference over the next century. And just to show that, you know, there's some of the exciting things which we don't really understand, but which are on the cards, and I think this is my last slide. Transcranial direct current stimulation, Tdcs. Has anybody heard of this? Put your hand up if you've heard of this. Okay, so we've got about 3 or 4 people. Fascinating stuff. Essentially, if you put a 2 milliamp current across your scalp using a couple of electrodes, it appears to improve the rate at which you learn quite significantly. So, for example, in military training for staff going into Afghanistan, they found the rate at which their staff were learning using interactive virtual environments was twice the speed of learning when they had this 2 milliamp current going across their scalp. Now, we don't really understand how this works, but the evidence is mounting that it does. And in fact, the last 2 studies that have been done with it are on numerical abilities, and it's shown lasting, very significant improvements in numerical ability. So at the moment, there's all sorts of ethical issues, all sorts of questions to be answered. Some people are saying, yes, it improves one ability at the cost of another, but clearly science has a lot of questions to answer, but it's also got a lot of potential in terms of improving ability. So exciting stuff, and perhaps we are moving towards a new science of learning in the future, which is going to combine all these insights and provide a better education as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. Our next speaker is one of the only 4 on the panel who is not actually employed by Bristol University, although his wife is. Dr. Shame, he says. Dr. Jon Turney is a science writer, futurologist and journalist. He's the author of The Rough Guide to the Future and recently the essay Imagining Technology, published by Nesta, which explores the relationship between developments in technology and science fiction. Dr. Turney.
I'm wired, so I think I won't use that. Good morning, thank you. So moving swiftly on, I'm bid to talk to you about environment, disaster, and catastrophe, and other cheerful things. I'm going to simplify and say, well, in the future of this century, I think there's only really one catastrophe we need to worry about, and that is global change, and particularly climate change. And say a few things about the context in which we can try and encourage people to think about those, because I think that's where we can offer some ideas about future education. So I'll start here. We've seen one of these already. If I asked you what you might guess this slide would depict, there's a whole range of phenomena I suspect you'd offer, but let's just consider it first in the abstract. I've just learned that abstract is good. It conduces to long-term learning and retention. First thing to emphasize is a bit of basic maths education, really. The simple properties of an exponential. If you see a curve like this, say you're plotting something against time, then the value at time b is the value at time a to some power greater than 1. It's only got to be just over 1. If the difference from 1 is small, it just takes longer to for the doubling time. So 3.5% savings, which is a rate quite a lot of us would be pleased to see at the moment, gives you a doubling time of around 20 years. And of course, we've all seen plenty of things which have been growing at these kinds of rates with these kinds of doubling times. We may not realise quite how many of them there are, or quite how unusual this is historically, and that's my emphasis for the middle of this little pitch. That's the other educational part. Most of us think first of this one, which not coincidentally is an almost perfect replica of the exponential curve. This is human population over around the globe in the last 1,000 years. Clearly exponential. There are, on shorter time scales, it's easy to conjure up graphs of lots of other quantities which look pretty much the same. Energy, which is the master resource, enables us to do all the other things we want to do. World energy consumption since 1820 looks rather similar. The inner wedges, of course, are all fossil fuels, which is what makes all these other curves possible. Obviously tied closely to fossil fuel. World GDP per capita, not only are there all those extra people, but we've all got richer in the last 200 years, which is nice. But at the expense of emitting rather a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. This is the same shape again, same time scale, the amount of billions of metric tons of carbon emitted from all our industrial and energy generating activities. It's moving a bit closer to my theme of catastrophe. And then, of course, some of that carbon hangs around, and the curve of the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere also looks rather similar again. You could go on compiling these, and people have. You won't be able to see the details here, but this is a slide put together based on a compilation by the International Biosphere Programme, scaled so that they all look roughly the same. These are mostly the last couple of 100 years, and we have the amount of methane emissions, the number of dams, ozone depletion, the number of motor vehicles, incidents of floods, numbers of telephones, even McDonald's restaurants are plotted on one of these. So everything basically looks the same. This is, as it's been called, the great acceleration in our global human society, and it leads to the period that's been labelled as at the top of this slide, the Anthropocene, where the mass of humans and their activities begin to have geologically scaled influences on the entire planet. That's the past up till now. If we go back if we want to ask what happens next, which is what we're trying to teach people about, there's a range of possibilities. Let's go back to our mathematical plot. A mathematical plot, exponential or otherwise, can just go on upwards. That's fine. Real things tend not to do that. And then we have to look at some of the other possibilities. There's obviously a great range of these, but there are two classes of them concentrate the mind. There's this one, which is perhaps the preferable option. Let's call this saturation. If we could achieve this, our plot of human population is actually, if you go back, it's level over the last 10,000 years. So we'd be describing, with the exponential part of this curve, a switch from one rather low, fairly stable state to another stable state, which we can aspire to with a much larger global population. One of the extreme alternatives, of course, with which we're rather familiar as a prospect, is this one, which we'll call collapse. And I think we have, all of us, an intuitive sense that this is a possibility, and that underlies our response to the individual disasters, floods, droughts, hurricanes that we see so often in the press. And we've been warned about this possibility for some time. What's actually happening? Let's go back to population. Demographic projections change quite fast, but they're better grounded than most future predictions. And although the precise course of the curve is uncertain, the dynamics vary from country to country, there's lots to teach about in there. The fact is that the great population, the great acceleration has slowed down. Praise be. Since I first started worrying about these things in the 1970s, coming out of the 60s when the global rate of population increase was 3 or 4%, slowed down quite a bit. And pause a moment and think where that locates us, people alive today in history. It's an extraordinary thing that we all know, but I don't think we appreciate it as intensely as we might. This slide, which I borrowed from Corinne Lequeret, who directs the Tyndall Climate Centre at UEA, is interested in these things, inscribes on the population curve dates derived from the assumption that everyone in the room is roughly of working age, so we have some bounds. So let's say the oldest person in the room was born in 1950-ish, makes them 5 years older than me. That person saw the population double from the 2.5 billion which around the world when they were born in the first 40 years of their life. That's already something that's completely unprecedented in human history. Nobody alive before that saw the human population double in their lifetime. And they will probably live to see another 2.5 billion, the total global population before they were born, at the time they were born, added in their remaining lifetime, because we'll hit 7.5 billion a few years from now. For younger people present, let's say they were born 20 years ago, they can expect to see another part of this transition. There'll be a clear downturn in the global total before the end of the century. So that generation too, if we're fortunate, we'll see a transition which is also unique. And we bear in mind as we say this that people entering school now, with an increased life expectancy we all enjoy, barring catastrophe, will probably see the 22nd century. So education then, for the kind of world they'll live in, means giving them the kind of grasp of the challenges and opportunities of this transition. And positively, one hopes it involves teaching them that we have an opportunity to avoid the collapse calculated in limits to growth style models if we can make some of the other curves play out more like this one than they look like doing at the moment. So the global job is to, I think, to recognize the very special character of the historical moment that we're living in, the Great Acceleration and the Anthropocene, and to think how globally we can shift those curves. As I've said, the simple view of this is, and it is my view, the bottom line is that energy is the master resource. Most of the other problems, if we have enough energy, we can fix. Not having it, as many people in the world don't have access in the way we do at the moment, is a disaster in itself. So we need to figure out how to secure an energy supply without releasing all that carbon in this century, not in the next one. That's too late. Final points, just to emphasize that one shouldn't say that, give the impression that the acceleration is, ignore that, is all bad. You can get a similar plot for the number of nations who are in some index democratic. So perhaps fossil fuels allow the evolution of global democracy because people getting richer are more prone to govern their societies in non-violent ways. And part of the same dynamic, science and technology have also increased exponentially over the last 150 years, as this plot of patent applications shows as an index of scientific, technical and general inventive activity. So the present moment is special in all of these ways. A whole diverse set of conversations start from here. I think I'd close by saying that one should also teach people that for them, I hope, as it is for me, it's also the most interesting time possible to be alive if there's a chance of solving some of these problems. And the final point is that technology can present these things now in a more graphic and more exciting way than I've just done with all these abstract plots. I won't have time to run this for you, but if I click on this link, it takes you through to a Vimeo animation of the Anthropocene, which puts all this data together. And I encourage, if you want to make a note of that or ask me for the URL afterwards, there are some wonderful depictions of how we can get the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration fixed in our minds now, done by creatives, which I'm a writer, so I can't do visual stuff, but it's happening with the new technologies we have. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll be all downloading that video later on this evening. Next, we have the former head of the Graduate School of Education, no less, Professor Ros Sutherland. Professor Sutherland will be talking about learning and emerging technologies, two topics that have been prime in her research. Indeed, she has a new book out, I believe, not quite, but fairly soon, calling for changes to the school system to address issues of education and social justice in a digital age.
Thank you. So let me just check. Okay, so later this year, I hope this book that I've been struggling over for the last few months is going to be out. And the title of the book is Education and Social Justice in a Digital Age. And it reflects my research over the last 10 or 15 years, but it's also taken me into huge new areas, really, that relate to social justice. And one of the things that I've concluded in the book, and probably I knew it before, but it became very evident to me, is what I think the huge challenge for the rest of this century is to do something about the divide in the educational opportunities for the young people in this country. So we have a double divide in terms of educational opportunities. We have a divide between the private sector and the state sector, but we also have a divide between the state sector that is good enough and the state sector that is not good enough. And I've come to wanting to write about this through my work in South Bristol, through my work as a governor of Merchants Academy in South Bristol. And that school has been open now for 5 years, but what I have become aware of in terms of educational opportunities is that the young people in South Bristol are deeply disadvantaged compared to many of the young people in other parts of the city. For example, the proportion of young people from Withywood, which is the area where Merchants Academy is, that go on to higher education is 5% or less. The proportion that go on to higher education from Clifton, for example, is 50%. And I don't want to be arguing that higher education is what is important, but I've drawn quite a lot, thank you to Angela and Leon, on the work of Sen and looking at the idea of capabilities or the opportunities to become in your life. And what I'm arguing is that all young people should have similar opportunities to become what it is they want to become. That could be going into employment, it could be going into higher education or doing an apprenticeship. But I suppose for me the biggest challenge is to ask what we can do about this situation that currently exists. So I'm going to take make a few arguments. This is a quote that came from a head teacher of one of the schools that we interviewed, my colleagues and I, when we were doing a project on transition between primary and secondary. And this was a view that we came from quite a few teachers. I'm not really bothered how much geography or history they know, because I don't think we should be measuring children's progress and how much they know, because they can access it on the web. This is the 21st century. And I think, for me, what's more important is giving them the tools. You could argue that that is coming from what might be called a skills-based approach or a learning-to-learn-based approach. I'm arguing quite strongly against that approach in my book, because that approach often reflects a view that in this digital age, we are going to be able to access information, and we no longer need to teach some of those knowledge domains in school. Well, I argue quite strongly against that, because I'm arguing that these knowledge domains are more than information and facts. They're conceptual areas that are challenging to learn about. This was a quote from another head teacher that we interviewed, and she said, "I think that the starting point for anything is the needs of the children. If the children that come to my school have a specific need, then I think it's up to me to provide that need. If I was in an independent school and had children who were all capable of 10 grade A stars at GCSE, would I be thinking of going down this route?" And by the way, this route was the RSA's Inquiring Minds. I might have got that name wrong. That's the route she'd gone down, not if it wasn't appropriate for them. And that's the route that school went down. Now, when I looked at that more closely, what's coming out of that quote is that there are some teachers that if you look at the needs of the children, say you need to go down one route, and then she's saying, if I was an independent school, I might go down another route. So I'm arguing that I don't believe that you can have a divided system. I don't believe that it's fair that some schools choose to go down one route and others go down another route. And what that means is that the educational opportunities are different in terms of what the schools offers. And there is some evidence from our work and other work that this polarisation into what you might call a skills-based or a subject-based is divided on social class lines. And when you look back into the history, and I'm not a historian, but it's quite clear that the social class divisions that existed in this country when, for example, I passed the 11 plus and there was only 2 in my school of 30 who did that, those social class divisions absolutely haven't gone away. Okay. That's just another quote from the same teacher, but I think I'll skip over that. Now, what I'm doing in my book is I'm drawing on Michael Young's idea of powerful knowledge. It's quite a subtle argument that he's making, and I think he's very conscious that his argument for what he calls powerful knowledge could be taken up by what people are calling the Govians in terms of subject-based curriculum. But he's actually making something very different, and he's just about to publish another book where I think he makes it more clear, putting a whole load of things together. But he says, he talks about needing the concept, which he calls powerful knowledge, and he has coined the phrase powerful knowledge to contrast it, which would have been the elite system that I was part of when I went to what was a grammar school, which is knowledge for the powerful. And in terms of thinking about knowledge in this way, you have to think of it as a sort of social construction, and there's a whole load of areas that we would have to talk about in terms of what it would mean to teach and learn these sorts of bodies of knowledge. And I suppose if I was to argue with Paul, I might wonder whether some of the things that he's wanting to teach through the games, whether I would want to call that powerful knowledge or not. So I think I've got a little example next. This is an example from some research I did a long time ago. My background is in maths education, and so that often means that some of the examples I use do come from mathematics education. But this is an example of an assessment that where a child solved a problem in the primary school coming from a Key Stage 2 test. And I found quite a lot of examples of this. Now, if you looked at that question, you might say, let's see what the question says. It's about paving slabs, and he needs 4 rectangular and 4 square, and what's the total cost? Now, the intention probably behind that test was to teach multiplication. And what's actually happened is the child has solved it, I didn't recently check, but I think it's correctly, through repeated addition. And my argument from that example, as a metaphor really, is that multiplication is powerful knowledge. Unless you as a teacher intend to teach multiplication, children, if you celebrate their informal knowledge, if you even celebrate some of the things they might have learned outside school, will probably be able to solve it using repeated addition. But unless you have an intention to teach multiplication, then they're not likely to be learning multiplication. So that's a little example that I want to give of powerful knowledge, and the fact that if you want children to learn that, and if you agree that they should learn that in terms of opportunities to become, then you've got to find a way of teaching it. And of course, we don't mean teaching is telling. That's another whole complex debate. Okay, moving on. How many more minutes have I got? Okay. And this is a quote from somebody called Wheelahan, She's done a lot of research in Australia on vocational courses. She's really strongly attacked the competency-based approach that's through a lot of the vocational courses, and she's attacked the idea that in vocational education, often there's a view that you don't need to engage with some of these substantive knowledges. And she says, quite strongly, unless curriculum is organised so that working class students and others who are excluded have equitable access to knowledge, they will always be on the outside looking in, largely excluded from society's conversation about what it should be like. And I think that's a very important and powerful argument. I know we would have to have extensive discussions about what we mean by access to knowledge, but I think the starting point is some of these substantive domains. And in fact, to understand what you're talking about, you need quite a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, in a sense, to really be able to engage with some of your arguments, I would argue. Okay, so I haven't said much about the digital. I've said that I don't think this I'm now very, what's the word? I would want to argue strongly against this idea that the digital means we won't need schools anymore, and the digital means you'll be able to access all this stuff from the internet, so I argue strongly against that. But I do believe that we are in a digital age, and therefore the digital has to be incorporated in schools. And if you look at the people in this country who are pushing the school improvement, you find that they don't really engage with the digital. I mean, our Chief Inspector of Ofsted has banned mobile phones from schools, so they don't engage with the digital. So I'm arguing you have to engage with the digital, but not in the ways that a lot of people have been engaging. So I'm arguing, and this comes from a lot of my research and influenced by what we call sociocultural theory, is that we have to use the digital to expand the possible. Now, that's not digital, but they are technologies. And the picture on your left is my dad, and the picture on your right is my grandson. I don't know whether they're about the same age. I know my grandson is 3, so my dad might be about the same age there. I just like that because he's got 2 scooters. I have no idea whether or not in having 2 scooters, he thought that would be more powerful than 1 scooter. We just don't know. We can't ask him. He's dead now. And then the little boy, who's my grandson, has this wonderful balance bike, which is absolutely fantastic and absolutely powerful. I just want to leave that because I believe that these technologies, the digital technologies, can transform what we can do. I really think it's important to consider that. So, for example, a pen is a technology. I write with a computer. That's a technology. I've argued in my book that I don't think I could have become an academic even if I'd had to write with paper and pen, because there's things that I find I struggle with, and so writing with a computer is one of the things that's helped me to become an academic. And I think for all young people, they have to try to understand what it is about the digital that they can learn and use and exploit to enable them to expand the possible.
Thank you for that. A fabulous reminder that technology isn't always about the new. Finally, to broaden this discussion to a global level, we have Dr. Angeline Barrett. Dr. Barrett started her career teaching in East Africa, and a main focus of her research has been on improving the quality of education, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Sadly, we already know the world is on track to miss the Millennium Development Goal for 2015 for universal primary education. But luckily, some people are already starting to look at what the goals could be beyond 2015, and one of those is Dr. Barrett.
Okay, well, thank you very much for kind of starting me off at the starting place I was planning. I was talking about the Millennium Development Goals, which were UN development goals set in the year 2000. It wasn't the first time that the UN set goals for universal primary education, though that would be in the 1960s. In the year 2000, it was estimated that there were 121 million children who were out of school. It is now estimated that there are 57 million children out of school. Looking in the longer view, in about 1890, I believe that about a third of children went to primary school. And now we're looking globally at enrolment ratios of around 90%. So we shouldn't be too glum. Things have stagnated since the financial crisis in 2008, but that is also partly because I think we've been aiming for the low-hanging fruit in terms of getting children into school. And it's now we're looking at getting the hardest to reach children into school. So the big issue between 2000 and 2015 is get them into school. But what we're finding, as this image represents, is that many children are not completing primary education, and many, even when they do complete, are not learning. So, for example, in Nicaragua, about 61% of children reach year 4 of primary school, but only 74% of them reach a minimum learning level of learning as it was defined in an international survey in Latin America. And of course, there's massive inequalities, as Ros has just been talking to us about. So, for example, if you are female, poor, rural, and Hausa living in northern Nigeria, you're lucky if you get more than a few months of schooling, whereas the national average for Nigeria is probably about 60%, if I remember it correctly. And for children with disabilities, less than half of children with disabilities or young people with disabilities between the age of 15 and 19 years old have been to primary school in Malawi. After talks about technology, this is really just a visual reminder of what the technology is like in many schools. There's always a danger in putting up an image of one classroom because, of course, there is massive variety. Even within countries, there is a lot of variety, and that teacher probably has a mobile phone in his pocket. Never mind, all the same, the issues, I think, when it comes to technology in education is toilets rather than tablets in a lot of places, clean water. When it comes to improving cognitive function, nutrition, not physical exercise. So where are we heading now? Well, it's 2015, time to review the development goals. And of course, the debate is still going on. I'll tell you what the development goals will be, the new development goals, in December 2014. But based on some of the literature that I've been reading, coming out of some UN conferences and particularly the high-level panel of eminent persons, which was co-chaired by our very own David Cameron, and some of the consultations that have been going on with respect to an education goal. The talk is that in 2015, we won't have Millennium Development Goals, that will seem old hat, but we will have sustainable development goals. So there is some kind of response to the issues that Jon has been raising today. Sustainable, however, has 4 dimensions. The environment is one, but is also defined as having dimensions to do with the economy, society, and governance. And some might argue that that represents a dilution in terms of the priority that is placed on the environment, and that dilution is apparent in some documents more than others. With respect to an education development goal in particular, there is the argument that we need to look at equity. So we need to be looking at not just the overall number of children who are in school, but how many children, for example, from the poorest quintile are in school. There is an argument that we can't just focus on primary education, but we need to be looking, they say, across the life cycle. Although when you look at the targets that are being suggested, life cycle stops at 19, which is bad news for most of us here. And it certainly doesn't include higher education. But we need a goal that includes targets for pre-primary education, for primary, for secondary, and for post-secondary and skills. And that it's not just getting children into schools, but it's what happens inside those schools that matters, the learning. We need to be measuring learning outcomes to ensure that by the time children complete primary school, they're able to read and write. And then perhaps also there's some suggestions we should be measuring skills, but we're not sure how to do that. We haven't got much time to work it out either. But what we're debating here today is not how much learning and how many. We're debating what we should be learning. And I would argue, this is taken from this is the theme of the UN conference that very much set the agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals back in June last year. I would argue that what we should be learning, if we want to ask that question, we need to be asking, what kind of society do we want? What kind of future do we want? And one of the errors I'd say that we've made in the last 13 years, going back to the year 2000 and the age of the Millennium Development Goals, is that there's been a tendency to compartmentalize the development goals. And so that people who are concerned about education globally, as I am, have tended to only think about the education goal. And when you ask them about the other 7 Millennium Development Goals, they may struggle to name them all. And if we want to answer the question what we should be learning, if we want to survive and if we want to thrive to the end of the century, I would say we need to be looking across all of the development goals that are set. And all the sustainable, what I hope will be sustainable development goals, which are set towards the end of next year. And I'm sorry to say that in the education debates that I've seen going on concerning what the education goal should be, there has been very, very little mention of the environment. And when sustainability has been mentioned, it's usually in terms of economic sustainability, how we can sustain economic growth. So I think that in the field of education, perhaps we've been rather slow to rise to this challenge. That's a list of what may possibly be the Sustainable Development Goals. This was the list produced by the high-level panel, so it's certainly one of the more significant fora that have been put together in the last year or so. And I'm not saying that it's a perfect list, I'm not saying that it's a comprehensive list, but it's one of the lists that we have at the moment. And so looking at a list like this, we need to ask, what does it mean for education and what does it mean for what we should be learning? And I'm only going to pick out 2 things. I could sit here for the next 10 or 15 minutes discussing that list. I'm only going to pick out 2 things, and I'm going to pick out these 2 things because they've been said already today. If we're going to end poverty, and also in terms of what the education goal is aiming towards, well, then we need to ensure that poverty is not a barrier to learning at any stage through our lives. And I will say the same for gender and the same for disability. And the second thing to pick out, of course, is the issues of, you can see that environmental sustainability does appear here. In terms of how we're going to secure sustainable energy or live with less energy, how we're going to manage the natural environment, and also how about having a curriculum in which we look more at food, how it's produced locally, and how we prepare food. Many other things I could say, but I will stop there, except to say that I think getting this right does depend on debate, reasoned, opened debate. I'm glad we have started the debate here. Let's take the debate beyond these walls and into the places where we are working. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm afraid I've been passed a note saying that because of the previous overrunning session, there isn't going to be any time for questions, which is incredibly frustrating because I have a dozen questions I'd like to ask about how pessimistic the panel are about the future. Should we be educating for the apocalypse? What do these changes in technology mean? But the good news is you can catch up with all the panel members during the lunch break. There is also an exhibition on educational histories on the 3rd floor, and it's highly recommended that you take a look at that. But in the meantime, I hope you'll join me in thanking all of our panel.